Trump Organization is well known in the real estate business world over. It's a brand to reckon with. Donald Trump Jr., this is perhaps his 6th visit to India in the past 3 years. It's great to have him with us on this special interview. Great to have you with us, Donald.
Good to be here.
I know, short kind of visit, and glad you could squeeze a time out for this.
I'm glad to do it. Glad to do it. Yeah, this is a little bit shorter than my usual visit, but glad to be here nonetheless.
Great, Donald. Just to start off, get a sense from you. There are a lot of concerns in India, about what's happening in the U.S., especially the real estate market. I mean, through your various businesses, you have a sense of what's happening there. Can you give us an indication of what's happening on the ground, and do you see a recovery?
Well, I think the first thing, and as I said in my speech, I mean, one of the biggest problems that gets people into trouble is talking generalities, right? It's very difficult to talk about the U.S. market or the U.S. real estate market because, I mean, certainly you break it up further from, the U.S. market, you break it up into asset classes, right? Residential, then housing versus condominium type development. Then you talk about commercial, retail, resort. So then you break it down further into states. Then you break it down into cities and zip codes. And, I really like to look at real estate in terms of breaking it down to the asset level. And I think the biggest problem that people got in over the last few years, and this is in the U.S., certainly in the emerging world in India, well, real estate is real estate, right? Real estate never goes down. Prices never change. They're always perfect and positive. So I think what we have to do is look at real estate on an asset level, right? This building is different than that building across the street, and that's the way you have to look at real estate. If you don't, you're going to get yourself in trouble. It's not a spreadsheet game. Real estate isn't. So, but I think if I am going to break, my thought and, talk a little, general, I think in certain asset classes, I think, we've seen the worst of the fall. Right? Everyone jumped off a cliff. That doesn't mean we're in the upswing, right? The upswing isn't going to be a rapid V. It's not going to, shoot back up to eternity. It's going to take a long time to recover in terms of, nominal value. It's going to take a long time to recover in terms of real value, especially when you start accounting for inflation and some of these things that people, we tend to forget about, right? We talk about inflation, but we don't include oil pricing. It's perhaps the largest commodity, and we conveniently take it out of the way we're looking at inflation. It's just not realistic. So in this world where we've come back to reality and look at things, we recognize, the worst is probably over in terms of the downslope, but I think we're still going to get worse, but progressively less worse over time. So, I think certain sectors have perhaps a longer way to go. I think the commercial office world has a little bit more to go than, residential that really took a beating very quickly and very fast. I think the government naturally is more focused on fixing that because that's where people live. Those are people's homes. So there's been a little bit more of an active attempt to fix those kind of markets. So, again, generally I think the worst is probably over. We are still going to see a little bit of a downturn. I've always said, 2009 is going to make 2008 look like 2006. and I think for the most part I've probably been pretty right. I mean, it's been a rough year in the U.S. and around the world. And, perhaps the most interesting thing is that, we're not decoupled like everyone thought. The U.S. is going to be in for a big problem. We realized, everyone's in that same boat. Everyone, lost track of reality and took things a little bit too far. And, eventually you have to pay the piper.
Right. Now, just to get a sense, you have front-facing businesses as well. You have the real estate brokerage. You have financial services wing. To try and get a sense in terms of demand coming back. I know it's a different segment you operate in, whereas the problems may have been in slightly different segments, but there would be some kind of a general sort of a pickup, a general trend.
Well, I think the problem really were all sectors, right? It wasn't just real estate that went down. I think real estate went down across the board because countries either said, well, I'm just going to focus on real estate. Well, if you focus on just building buildings, but don't create an infrastructure to support them, don't create other jobs for people to actually have a reason to want to occupy those buildings. I mean, you saw a lot of that in the Middle East, right? We'll build 400,000 units. We have a population of 400,000, and they all have homes already, but people are going to want to come here to buy real estate? Well, you need a diversified economy to accommodate these things. I think you do see a desire and a need for people to try to get back into those other sectors. You see people actively looking for mortgages. Now is probably the time to buy real estate as opposed to 2 years ago, right? You have a rational basis that if you're looking at real estate again, not in terms of I want to flip in the next 2 months, but I want to hold it and live here for 10 years. It's a basis that you can get comfortable with in the long term, which is the way real estate ultimately should probably be looked at, right? Not if you're looking at real estate where every time I'm going to flip in 6 months for 50% upside, something's wrong in the equation. So you do see that desire. Now the problem is it is very difficult to get financing. Certainly not the financing that we had 3 years ago, but that was never realistic anyway, right? Get 120% financing for projects, get 120% financing for loans to do real estate because real estate prices never go down apparently. That's, kind of the mantras that we're hearing. So now you have perhaps the opposite problem in that the correction may have been to the opposite extreme. Now things are looked at so conservatively that people who want to buy a home, that can buy that home at a very good long-term, rational basis, that are putting their money where their mouth is, have real equity in the deal, they can't even get reasonable financing there. So perhaps the problem's overcorrected on the opposite extreme, but you do see a desire for people to try to want to get in there. It is tough from a lending perspective right now because there's just very few options for you, even if you have a deal that does make sense. So, hopefully you'll see that tide start to shift. And again, I think once a few deals happen, deals will beget other deals. Once you see that flow, no one wants to be the first guy in. I've always joked about commercial real estate. The next big bubble is going to be distressed real estate because people who bought at a 20% discount thinking that was distressed, they overpaid if the real distress is 50%. So no one wants to be the first person to pull the ripcord. But when it does happen, I think that'll really create a lot of the flow that will really bring us into the next positive cycle.
So who'll bail the cat? That's right. But in terms of the desire, you have a financial arm where you do sort of extend credit. Are you willing to feed, are you trying to feed into the desire to buy houses?
I think naturally. I mean, I want to look at things when no one else wants to look at them. That's probably when you're going to make your best deals. And so I think, that sector is there. It is difficult because, again, money is not loose as it once was. We're in a world where today, cash is king. Unfortunately, very few people have cash. Those who do are still waiting on the sidelines. But I do think the desire is there to start moving things forward.
Great. So broadly, the message in terms of the U.S. that you're sending out is the slump is over. Pickup is starting gradually. It will take time. But let's sort of try and now move to Asia broadly.
Well, I'm saying the slump isn't over, but the worst of the slump is over. All right, so we've fallen off the cliff. Now we're rolling down the hill a little bit. So, it'll probably get a little worse for some time. It's just not going to get worse at the same pace that when it went bad. If you look at the curve, it went down like this. Right. What I'm saying is, well, we went down like this. Now we'll probably go down like this before we start a gradual recovery that'll take a long time.
Okay, so what you're saying is basically in terms of the slope is going to change. It's going to go down a little slower now. So I stand corrected.
It's getting less worse.
So those are some interesting comments coming out on the U.S. We come back with Donald Trump Jr. to speak about the Asian economy and the real estate sector. Coming back in a bit. Asia, do you see Asia as a contrast to what's happening in the U.S., the emerging economies, or would you largely?
I think, again, there too, basis has been readjusted. I think, the Asian markets, the emerging markets, I think, but especially if we're talking Asia, I'm going to talk China and India, because really, those are the big boys, right? The emerging world is many, and there's many countries, but if we're really talking about it, in my mind, that makes up 85% of the emerging world, in those two countries. And I think, there's an incredible resiliency here in China. I think there's an incredible desire to be successful. In these countries, everyone wants to be a mogul. Everyone will do whatever it takes to get there. And because of the last cycle, everyone's also got a taste, of what it was like to be king and to be, to have those things. I think that works very well for us in a 5-star brand because people start to appreciate luxury a little bit better. But, that aspirational notion of wealth is so powerful here, that I think, they're going to recover a lot faster. not only in the sense that there is a lot of opportunity. You know, when you talk about India, it's growing slowly this year, just over 7%. I mean, you can't even fathom that kind of growth, you know, in the developed world. It just doesn't exist. I mean, I think very much so the same in China. So the potential here is incredible, but I also think, and perhaps what I touched on a little bit in my speech is, you know, this part of the world, because it's so new to them, there's probably also a tendency to forget some of the mistakes from the past a lot sooner, right? The second you see that next bill, oh, I'm all in, we're all. So, you know, hopefully what people can get from what I talked about there is, yeah, make those decisions, get back in, but do it with a rational notion as opposed to just an arbitrary, you know, all-in mentality of, well, real estate just went up 2%. Wow, real estate's the new tech. That's all we're going to be focused on. And, you know, when your dentist becomes a developer again, you start looking, because if too many people are too long, there's probably an issue in the market.
True. But Donald, just to focus on, you know, the Trump organization and your activities in this part of the world. I know you did a significant project in South Korea. You were mentioning, you know, a while ago, earlier when we were chatting about your recent trip to the Middle East and Egypt. What markets are you looking at? What kind of projects are you looking at? What are you on the lookout for since you look after acquisitions for the group?
You know, I don't look at markets, like I said. You know, I look at deals. You know, there's throughout history. I mean, whether it's the best market in the world or the worst market in the world, generally, there were great deals and there were horrible deals in that same market at that same time. So, you know, I don't look at markets. I look at the individual assets and the individual deals. You know, as I look into the emerging markets, I think the way I'm likely to enter, because things have changed. Again, now with prices going down nominally, very substantially in New York, in these areas, well, that's my backyard. If that starts to make sense for me in terms of basis, you know, the emerging world is now competing with the developed world. It's not like, well, the emerging markets is the only place you want to be, and that's where everything is. I wouldn't touch a deal in New York with, well, now it's a very different proposition. You know, the risk-adjusted rewards, you know, could start be swaying back towards the developed world because it starts to make sense in there. So, you know, I'm looking at deals that compete with other deals. I'm spending a lot of time in these markets. I'm a big believer in the Indian marketplace. I'm a big believer in China. There are difficulties to doing those deals. Those difficulties have been really highlighted over the past few years and months. And so as it becomes and starts to make more sense to do deals in your own backyard, perhaps that delays, you know, the notional idea of getting into a market. So again, I look at all of them. I travel in, you know, very extensively, probably in, you know, international travels once a week or once every other week at least. And so we are focused all over the place, but I'm going to really have to say I'm going to look at the individual deal in any one of those markets because there's probably a great deal to be made, and in that same market and perhaps across the street, there's probably a lousy deal to be made.
Yeah, but in terms of, you know, broadly, the Indian market you were talking about a little while ago in terms of the difficulties, you know, that you face, say, in markets like India. What is it that you believe that a government that is looking to attract, you know, developers, looking to attract investment, can do to try and, you know, get more infrastructure going in the country?
Well, you know, infrastructure was a big one, but I think, you know, perhaps for me as an outsider, you know, to skew that risk-reward back in favor of the emerging world, you have to really create a level of transparency. I think that's why I focused most on my speech. And, you know, I spent most of my time really highlighting the negatives, not because I'm not a believer in the markets, but I think it takes an outsider's perspective talking about those things to really instill it in their minds. I mean, everyone that's a player in the local market understands the demographics. They understand the positives. They know the potential. You need to hear it from an outsider's perspective, someone who, you know, would like to invest in an area where they think the flaws are to generate that kind of investment and fix those. So, I mean, for me, the biggest thing was transparency. You know, getting an and that's both, you know, on the government level, whether it's accounting regulations, you know, a legal framework, yada yada yada, but also from an intercompany perspective. I mean, there's plenty of developers I talk about who are developers. Well, I own this piece of land. Well, I don't own it. My cousin owns it. Well, my cousin doesn't own it. This guy owns it, but I can make a deal on it. And, you know, by the time you figure out, they have no affiliation with that piece of land whatsoever. And so, you know, creating a level of transparency where people can get, you're smiling because it's very true, and it's frustrating from the outside because when you think about it, you know, time is capital. It is money to me. So if I have to spend a lot of time on a project just trying to figure out who even owns it and if the person I'm dealing with actually has anything to do with it or they're just trying to insert themselves in a brokerage position, it makes my life very difficult, certainly from an underwriting perspective, but also on a relative value perspective when I'm comparing that to other parts of the world. So, I mean, I think government as well as the individual companies really have to work on transparency, whether it's in accounting standards, whether it's in kind of reporting standards, so that you can create at least a level playing field that you can analyze assets on their relative merits against one another effectively. Otherwise, everyone's just guessing, and it's purely a gamble as opposed to an investment.
Very interesting comments coming in from Donald Trump Jr. on real estate. There's much more to the man than real estate. He is on the show, Apprentice, all that and a lot more coming up. So in these difficult markets, would you say that partnerships are perhaps the way to go?
Well, I think definitely. I think, and that's ironic perhaps coming from a Trump, because I think we're pretty good at what we do. But I don't have the hubris to assume that I can do all things in all markets. There's relationships, not just amongst our partners, but amongst government people, the things it takes to drive a development. I mean, when you think about developing, there's a lot of little nuances that really have to be taken care of. And just because I can do it in New York, I recognize that I may not be able to do it in Mumbai or Delhi or somewhere else. So creating those partnerships and having an understanding with the local people is incredibly important. Frankly, I wouldn't enter this market by myself. I have too much to learn from others, and I recognize that, and that's perhaps people's biggest mistake. However, I have to know that the person I'm then getting into bed with is selling me the bill of goods that I actually think he's selling me, and that I can trust that I can do business with him. If I can't do that, it makes it very difficult for me to commit that kind of capital and commit the time that it takes to do those deals.
Right. You were talking about the Trump organization, your strengths, etc. A very strong brand, very strong in the development field, but you also had your cycles. You had phases where you've gone, had to go through financial stress. There is also an organization, Trump Entertainment, which is currently, there are some issues there in terms of, the Chapter 11 that's going on. You've been through this, you've seen the ups, you've seen the downs. How do you manage, these two sides, a very strong brand at one end, and you keep having these financial issues at the other?
Well, I think Trump Entertainment is probably the only example of the financial issues. That's not to say that there aren't deals that were much better 3 years ago than they are today. But Trump Entertainment's a public company. It has our name on it. We were a part of it 15 years ago, but haven't been an active part of management in many years, other than they have our name because we took it public years ago and let management take over. So, it has its issues, but as does anyone in the gaming industry, certainly in the U.S. and anywhere in the country. And if you look at the performance of those stocks, we're certainly not the only ones. But again, we're not immune to market cycles. We don't have anything to do with that one. But that's, again, not to say that there's deals that we are involved in that have worked out as well as we'd like. And I think what we've realized over the last cycle, and what everyone's realized, is that, hey, no one's immune to a downturn. Certainly not one of this nature, right? Again, I love to say that, oh yeah, Trump, knows better than we. No one knows. No one saw this coming. And, those who saw this coming certainly didn't see the extent to which it really hit everyone. So I think the biggest thing that we've done is we recognized from the early 90s, when my father did go through financial difficulties, that there is a cycle and that it does exist, that no one is immune, and it will eventually happen, which is why over the last few years we haven't done many equity deals because we couldn't rationalize the basis. We've been able to do things with our brand in terms of a license type model, where we're in, our development teams are involved, they're looking at things, but we're not necessarily contributing equity. So, if something happens, perhaps it's a blemish to the brand, but it's not also a blemish to the capital. Now, it's my job to be a protectorate of that brand and to prevent those things from happening as best you can, but it's certainly better than also playing with equity. Now, I also look at it, though, in some of these deals, if I'm putting my brand on something, that's perhaps more important to me as the next generation who wants to hand something down perhaps to my children to protect that brand. So I look at it as serious as I would any equity contribution, but we've been able to play that way. So it's been because of the brand that he's created over 30 years, it's been a very natural hedge. I can still play, I can still be in real estate, I just don't necessarily have to invest the equity dollars. So it was a very smart strategy that he learned from the downturn.
Talking about family, development, and you're being a public face, doesn't it get difficult when you're in a controversy?
Well, I'm very involved in the Scotland project, actually, so and it's coming along great. Listen, in any development, there's going to be natural hurdles there. In any project, you're going to run into these kind of things. We're actually going forward on the golf course pending final approval from the council on November 1st. So that aspect is going, and we'll work out the other issues in time, or we'll take our time, or we'll look elsewhere and put our money, wherever it makes sense to do so. To balance both things, though, from the entertainment side, I guess I'm blessed with the good fortune of not having to sleep a lot. So, when The Apprentice starts filming, and we start filming again in about 2 weeks, not even 2 weeks, actually, next week, which is the other reason why I'm sort of rushing back, everything else doesn't stop. Everything keeps going at exactly the same pace. I just sleep a little less because I also have to do some other stuff. So I think the most important thing, you just have to understand time management and to do all things. But it's very difficult to pass up great opportunities if they happen simultaneously. You just have to figure out how to get them done and do it.
So which one do you enjoy more? I know realty development is your heart, is your business, but you have The Apprentice on the other side. How do you sort of?
Well, if I'm looking at them, I think The Apprentice is fun. It's great. It's something that I think in 15, 20 years it'll be great to be able to look back and say, hey, that was pretty cool. It was on, a show televised around the world. That said, real estate development, that's my passion. I mean, that's our core business. That will be here when TV shows aren't. That is what, my skill set is. I'm not quitting real estate to be a reality TV show personality anytime soon. So I think it's great. It's added incredible value to the organization. Much more so than I ever would have thought, even from the beginning, and it's certainly been great for the brand. But that said, I'm a real estate guy.
Right. So you're a real estate guy. If I were just to ask you one question in terms of, if Trump were to come to India, what is it that Trump would bring to the Indian realty sector? Well,
I think, as I spoke a little bit about earlier, that aspirational wealth quality that is very present here. I think, the high-end real estate product that I see here is still very lacking relative to, high-end product around the world. It's not lacking in terms of the price that it's able to achieve. It's just very lacking in terms of the quality, the construction. And so I think, ultimately bringing a brand such as ours and the standards and the experience that our teams have building, the best projects around the world and the highest end quality around the world, I think it would show and bring, a level of quality that just hasn't been achieved in the market or hasn't been attempted in the market. And I think there is a desire for that, as and Indians are very big buyers of our product around the world, and certainly in New York. And so we do tend to cater to a very diverse demographic because of that, and they appreciate that brand and understand it. So I think as that mentality really expands here in India, I think we'd have a lot to offer in that world.
So you have the Trump card. Good having you with us,
Great to be
Donald.
here.
That was Donald Trump with us on his visit to India.